thank you all for coming. And in just a second, we're going to get Pamela into this room.
Yeah.
Welcome, Pamela, on behalf of uh, the Institute and the entire listening audience. Oh, yeah.
I hear David. Oh, I'm hearing the past, the ghost of Zoom past.
Oh, yeah.
Is
It's,
your Max MSP patch still on?
yeah, maybe your patch is still on.
Yeah, it could be.
Um, anyway, thank you so much. That was really fun.
Thank you for having me.
So the way this is going to work, just the bookkeeping for everybody here, because I know that people are going to have questions for you, is if you guys go to the chat button at the end of Zoom, by now we are experts in this, just put your name in the chat when you have a question. You don't have to write the question, and then I'll just call on you. So, and while we are waiting for people to ask you a question, I have one. So when did you know you were a gearhead?
I might have known that like when I was 11 or some weird thing.
How did that
Because I used
happen?
to
Yeah.
when I was a little kid, I used to play with tape recorders. And my father bought us a Craig cassette player. It was like the original, it was a newfangled device that no one had ever seen. And I absconded with it into my bedroom. And so he bought another one for my sisters to have. And that one ended up in my bedroom as well, because I was trying to learn how to do like overdubbing, and I was like singing into one and then playing that back and recording it into the other one. So I guess I started playing with machines pretty early on, if that was the substance of your question.
Well, yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense that it's sort of like the impulse to be a musician and the impulse to get technology involved in your musicianship, came pretty much at the same time. So, or at least close enough. That's kind of exciting. So I was really happy to see that you did the phonologue piece.
Oh, I'm glad you
So
enjoyed that. Yes,
yeah,
I did.
I wonder if I can just explain that. Yeah, so the sheet that you're holding up there, um,
Yeah, this used to be ubiquitous in all record stores. Do you remember record stores? So record stores, in the center of every record store was this thing that looked like a giant sort of overgrown telephone book, and it had thousands of pages, and they were all, it was like in bookstores you had books in print. So the phonologue was like whatever music was in print currently. And when I worked at Tower Records at Bay and Columbus in San Francisco, one of my duties was to update the phonologue, because we didn't have computers in those days. So it was in a physical book with like 1,000 these sort of yellow onion skin pages. And every week they would send an envelope with a stack of these pages and an instruction sheet that said, please replace page 1026 with pages 1026 and 1026B, and so on. And you would open up this ring binder thing and put the new pages in and take out the old pages as different things became available. So that, yeah.
this was actually part of my background too, because my high school job was working in a record store. And so the interesting thing about it is it really is an old technology. So it's kind of the gateway to something which doesn't exist anymore, which is, I think, something that you have to deal with all the time in what you're
Yes,
doing.
indeed.
I was saying before you came on that the first time I saw you do this was a million years ago, and it
Mhm.
seemed like your gear was a lot bigger then.
It was a big old like 6 space rack full of digital delays and multi effects units and samplers, and with a big old Mackie mixer sitting on top. And um, I would have to haul that thing around and patch it all up, before each gig. But now it's all in contained in this Max patch here. So in place of that big old 6 space rack, I'm carrying this laptop, and some, controllers and audio interfaces and things. But it's my gear is I can now like carry on everything I need for a gig. If I have a gig I can get to and spend just the night, so I don't need too many changes of clothes, I can go like with one carry-on bag and get everything I need there.
Yeah, it's the future. I mean, of course, it would be nice to be able to travel again so we could
Yeah.
test that. So I also
Yeah.
thought of that during the other rooms piece, because sort of like this is a room, like the
Hmm.
Zoom, we call this
Yeah.
a room, but
Yes.
it's not the room I want to be in. It's, I mean, I'm happy that we're all here, right? But
Yeah.
can you tell something about that piece, about how that what that piece
Yeah.
is and the
So
text?
that piece was so there's a way that I like to make works these days where I interview people. And so, whatever the subject of the piece is, I will bring people to my studio back when I could do that. And I will interview them. I'll put them in my little recording booth and I'll interview them and I'll ask them a bunch of questions about things related to whatever the piece is about. And then I will use fragments of their text to build the not only sort of ideas for the piece, but actually structure of the piece from these sort of text collages that I make. And so I made a piece called Memory Trace. This is a very roundabout explanation of how other rooms came about. I made a piece called Memory Trace many years ago, and I was on an artist residency at the Jurasi Resident Artist Program. And for Memory Trace, I interviewed all the other artists that were in residence. And one of them was a playwright named Paul David Young, who lives in New York. And um, he had this very warm, rich, resonant speaking voice. And so after I was finished making Memory Trace, the thing that happens is I will often interview upwards of 30, 40 people for these pieces. And so then what I end up using is just fragments. And so I have all this detritus from works I've done where I've been interviewed all these different people. And so sometimes I go trolling through that stuff. And so I had a gig actually for the Other Minds Festival. And this particular episode of Other Minds, or that particular iteration of Other Minds, was focusing on text sound. So Charles did this whole program where he invited all these text sound poets and people who are making music with language. And I just noticed Barry's like stacks of CDs. What is going on there? Anyway, um, sorry, my eyes are wandering to some of the other Zoom spaces, but um, so I wanted to make something new for that show, and I have a lot of pieces like Pop Titles You and other things that I could do that involve speech sounds. But I thought I'd like to make a new piece just dedicated for this particular Other Minds Festival. And I was going through all these interviews, and I found this material from Paul's interview where he was actually talking about a dream that he had. And so I just sort of cut him up and made it just sound like he was a little bit of a crazy person, and and built this because he had this dream about these other rooms that sort of materialized in his apartment. And so that's how I ended up building that piece.
That's great. We have a question for you from Marilyn Lavin. Marilyn?
I see her, but I cannot hear her because she's muted.
I was wondering what you were wearing on your hand.
Oh, I was wearing these little
And
guys, and they are gesture controlled instruments that I call MIM, and they were built for me by a very dear friend and collaborator named Donald Swearingen. And they contain various sensors. So all of these gesture instruments that you saw me using um, use sensors. and they just all have different sensors. But the ones I was wearing on my hands actually have 3 different sensors in them. They have a sensor that's called an accelerometer. They have something called gyro, and they have something called magnetometer. And so with all 3 of those sensors, I'm able to track the positions of my hands, like the sort of X, Y, and Z um, ways of turning my hands. And so that kind of gives me 9 degrees of control because I have these 3 different sensors and they all have X, Y, Z. So then in the software, I make decisions for each piece about like what those MIDI numbers that are generated by my hand movements will control. So in some pieces, I'm controlling, I'm just maybe playing sounds, like playing sampled sounds. And in other pieces, I may be controlling the processing on my voice, manipulating things in my max patch. So that, for example, let's see if that still works. Oh, it's not on. That's right. They're a little bad.
First turn it on.
Yeah. We'll have some.
Yeah.
So I can use them to play sampled sounds. Um,
That's remarkable. I don't know another form of art where the
yeah.
making is the art itself. It isn't that you're projecting something onto a screen or a canvas or another shape or form or anything else, but the movement is the work of art.
Well, thank you. And yeah, so that's kind of how I like to work. But
That's great.
yeah, so those are one of many different gesture controllers that I'm using, and I'm using all of them to just send messages to my computer to tell it either to play a certain sound or to change the processing on my voice, or to maybe I make a note with this hand and bend the pitch of that note with that hand. It just depends on how I've programmed it.
But you must be thinking of a zillion things all at the same time. Are you
Well,
not?
I think that's kind of true of playing any instrument, I mean, I always think about like drummers. I so admire drummers. Like, how on earth do they do like 4 things at once? They do things with each limb is doing something, and often something very different from what the other limb is doing. So, it's kind of a it's sort of a I don't know, I think David said something in his introduction uh, about virtuosity. And I think that that's something that when you're a performer, when you're a composer, your job is to write music that other people will play. But when you're a
Yeah.
composer performer, your job is to write music that you play. And so you have kind of 2 jobs, because you've also got to, whatever, no matter how difficult it is, you've got to be able to, you know, carry it out. And so I think it gives us sympathy, though, when we do compose for others. It gives us sympathy for them, in like not try not to write things that are unplayable.
That might help.
So we have a question from M. Lamar.
Oh,
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
I can. I want to make a different view so I have more people on my. There we go. I want to go gallery.
There's no video for me. I'm sorry,
There's no
but
video for you. Hi, how are you?
hi. I saw you at the kitchen in New York, and you were just amazing. I'm
Oh,
a huge
thank
fan.
you.
Huge
Thank
fan.
you.
And I actually
And
wrote the.
if I'm not mistaken, you have collaborated with my dear buddies, the Living Earth Show. Is that true?
I have. I made an album with him, and we've done many performances in New York, and actually the Cloisters here in New York. I'm
Mhm.
in New York, and also in San Francisco, and lots of locations in San Francisco. Old Virtus Church, we made the record. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love them.
Well,
I
so
just had
what
I'd
is
say
your
questions about your voice. How do
okay?
you, I mean, just the maintenance of your amazing voice, your range, your the technique, the ease of the high notes. I mean, are you sort of in study constantly to sort of maintain that? Do you work with someone? Or are you just doing lots of scales?
I should, but I don't. I'm one of these people I'm terrible at practicing. Even when I was growing up and I was studying viola, I always like did all the practicing like the hour before my teacher showed up. It was like I just I have a hard time practicing. What I do is play. And so I feel like I'm lucky because I'm singing all the time, I'm playing all the time, so that and I'm making things, and because of the way I work, in order to make things I have to sing. And
Yes.
so so I get my practice and my work that way. I have studied though in the past, like when I was in music school, of course, I had a wonderful voice teacher who I loved, um, who was actually the only person on the faculty who believed that it was okay to use your voice in different ways. Um, and if I had been studying with anybody else on that faculty, they would have like kicked me out of their studio if they found out that I was playing in clubs and like singing like Talking Heads covers and doing whatever. I
Yeah.
mean, I
And
wasn't,
you went to the
you know,
University of Colorado, right? You
I
went to
did.
Colorado? Yeah,
I
that's right.
did. And at that time it was like at least the vocal department was very conservative, but my teacher was one. He didn't really like new music, but he was open-minded and said, if you can sing high, then you should sing low too. If you can do this, you should also do that. And he was totally fine with me trying all these
That's
experiments and
fantastic.
doing other things.
Fantastic.
So he was a great teacher. When I moved to the Bay Area, I studied for a while with a bel canto teacher who taught a lot of the San Francisco opera singers, because I just wanted to I was making works that were using all different types of vocal techniques, but I
Yes.
wanted to sort of keep my bel canto thing there, and so that when I did that, I would be doing it right.
And you
So I
still have
started.
it. You still have it there. So it's a beautiful sound. I love the sound you make and everything
Well,
you do.
thank you. Thanks so much. But I haven't studied with anyone for a long time.
You're
We have
doing
a
beautifully.
question. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm
No,
sorry.
no, no, I'm fine. That's all.
We have a question from Ohm.
Um,
Ohm is a question, and
I'm
it's also
sorry.
a statement.
I'm looking at my favorite yoga teacher in the world is on one of these squares. And when you said Om, I just had to Om to her. But anyway, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Om. Where are you?
I think the question, if Ohm is too shy to say it,
Oh,
I'm
did Om type their
Ohm typed
question in
something in,
chat?
and the question is, did you ever work with a theremin early on?
Ah, I love it. I love it. People always think of the theremin. And at least in this case, Om knew that this is not a theremin. Most people just decide that this is a theremin, and they come up to me after the concert. They go, "Oh, I love your theremin. Can I play your theremin?" So the answer to that is I've never owned a theremin, but I have toyed with buying one for a long time, and I still someday am going to get myself one, but I don't have one. Um, but I have played other people's theremins, like just in rehearsal when I was working with people who had one, and I just like tried it, but I've never had one myself. It's kind of wonderful because I mean, really everybody wants this to be a theremin, and I think the reason they do is because the method of playing it is very similar to the method of playing a theremin. This is the one I was using where I have sensors on both sides, and I approach it this way to play it, and it uses ultrasound sensors, and so it's looking for mass, and it's just aware of how big or thick my hand is or how far or close it is to this. And so the theremin works a lot that way. It's not the same kind of sensor, but but it is reacting to the proximity of your hand. Um, and so, but the big difference between the instruments I'm using and the theremin, for those who don't know, I mean, the theremin it's a synthesizer, and it's one of the early electronic music instruments, and it was the first instrument that was ever known to be played without touching it. And if you've not seen one, they look like a sort of a box with these two sort of antenna sticking off one side, one sticking out that way and one sticking up. And you approach those antenna with your hands. One of those antenna controls the amplitude or how loud the sound is, and the other one controls the velocity or what pitch you're getting. And but it's a synthesizer, which means that it actually generates its own sound. And it really only has one voice, which is sort of like a musical saw. It sounds kind of, it's that sort of sound. Um, but whereas this instrument and all these other instruments that I'm using, they don't make any noise. They just make numbers. And so then those numbers go to the computer here, and they are messages telling it to do different things, which might be to make a note, but it might also be to change the value of some process that's happening, or so there's a lot of different things that you can do with them. But I have this, everybody always brings up the theremin, and I keep meaning to do this. I don't know when I'm going to find the time, but I really have this desire to sample a theremin or a musical saw and then play it with this. And then it will be like I do have a theremin.
You'll confuse everyone tremendously. I will say the great theremin player Rob Schwimmer was the entertainment at my oldest child's bar mitzvah, and my relatives are still talking about it.
Is that right?
So yeah, so it's
yeah. Now, isn't he somebody who, like, Mark Stewart has?
Yeah, that's Mark
worked
Stewart's
with?
partner. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Remy. Remy?
Yeah, I was kind of interested by your comment earlier about this space between composing and performing. And I guess my own background is as a bit of a bedroom producer and not an instrumentalist.
And you've got the bedroom to illustrate it.
Exactly, yeah. And I guess the question is sort of how does that work for your process? Do you notate the music that you perform, or is it sort of in your head? And is there an improvisation aspect of it?
Well, it's my method of composing differs wildly depending on what kind of work I'm making, because I have a really kind of varied body of work. I have a lot of solo voice and electronics works, like the things you heard me perform tonight. And I also have composed a lot of works for chamber ensembles and also for soloists. And I've composed like fixed media pieces for either like scores for dance companies or pieces that are intended for radio or and so forth. So with each of those different ways of composing, I approach it differently. Um, with composing for my solo voice and electronics, I rarely, if ever, notate that work, because I just learn it. And I'm, because it's intended for me to play, I'm the only one who has to know it. But when I make music that is for a chamber ensemble to play, then I do produce a written score. And actually, the creating of the score is almost becomes part of the compositional process in that case. So it varies a lot. And if I'm making a fixed media work, I'm not likely to make a score unless that fixed media work has some string parts or something, or a trumpet that I need. And then I have to write parts for those musicians who I bring them into my studio and or in these COVID times, I've sent them a PDF, and then they send me, I tell them to, play, use a click track and send it back to me. But yeah, so there's some notation going on in my work and some not. And then in terms of the improvisation question, I really find that for me, there is not a solid line between composition and improvisation, because I think of composition as a form of improvisation. And so, because what is improvisation? It's you're making it up, right? What is composing? You're making it up. So, I when I compose for myself, often I start by just setting up all of my stuff and just playing, and things just come out of me. And sometimes pieces will come out whole cloth, and I'll be like, this that's a piece. Hopefully I was rolling tape, or tape, um uh, digits or whatever, because then if I've recorded it, then I have to go back and learn it and figure out, like, how did I do that? And so even the pieces that come about because I improvise them completely, those do get set and they become a composition that when you hear me play it from one time to the next, you'll see that it's definitely the same piece. But those ideas often come from just trying things, and then those things come out and I say, oh my God, there's a piece. um, Sometimes I have to then sculpt it and say, okay, well, that's repeating too many times, or maybe I need a different section, or but there are times when it almost is like, without any editing, I sometimes come out with a piece that becomes a set piece. So it varies from time to time. But yeah, hopefully that kind of answers your question.